Subcommittee will come to order. Last week, President Obama announced his new strategy for fighting extremists in Afghanistan and Pakistan. I wholeheartedly support the President's new approach. The previous administration, by its own admission, never recognized that the true central front in the struggle to secure our nation was Afghanistan, where the 9/11 attacks were orchestrated and not Iraq. It's been clear for years that the last administration took its eye off the ball and allowed al-Qaeda and the Taliban to regroup and rearm in Afghanistan and the tribal areas of Pakistan. For years, the fight against extremists has been undermanned, underfunded, and lacked a coherent strategy. President Obama's new strategy recognizes those facts and moves aggressively to address them. I'm grateful and gratified that it contains many elements that I and others in Congress have been urging for several years. First, the President laid out a clear objective, which is, quote, to disrupt, dismantle, and defeat al-Qaeda in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and to prevent their return to either country in the future, unquote. I know that there has been concern expressed that focusing our attention on al-Qaeda, the reason U.S. forces in Afghanistan in the first place, somehow means that we are abandoning our efforts to establish functioning democratic government in that country. I think a close examination of the strategy reveals that the President intends to both stabilize the security situation in Afghanistan and continue our work to improve governance there. Successfully focusing on al-Qaeda will give us and our allies the exit strategy the President wants in order to reduce our military footprint there and to sustain allied involvement. But that does not mean that work on Afghanistan's democratic institutions won't continue. No discussion of an exit from Afghanistan can even be contemplated until the security situation is stable and al-Qaeda and the Taliban can no longer use Afghanistan as a base for terrorist operations. In the near term, that means more troops. I've been calling for additional U.S. forces for Afghanistan since 2002. So the President's announcement of 17,000 additional combat troops and 4,000 additional trainers is a welcome development. It is clear that neither we nor the Afghans have sufficient forces to take and hold territory once it has been cleared of extremists. More U.S. forces will allow us to do that. In the long term, more and better trained Afghan forces will be able to do it for themselves, allowing U.S. and other NATO forces to recede from into the background and ultimately withdraw. While we're on the subject of NATO, I know that the President will use the summit tomorrow to remind our allies that Afghanistan is their fight too. While some NATO allies may not be willing to provide more combat soldiers, there are other capabilities that they could provide, such as strategic airlift and military trainers and mentors that would support the overall security mission there. There are also civilian aspects of reconstruction and capacity building at both the national and local government levels with which our allies could assist. But more resources for more countries also has to mean more and better coordination by us. A signature result of the Bush administration's strategy of subcontracting Afghanistan to our allies is that there has been little central coordination of either the political or military effort, and many nations send forces with vastly different rules of engagement. Each nation charged with securing a portion of the country or rebuilding some devastated Afghan institution went off in their own direction with their own objectives and reported to their own national capital. It should surprise no one that as a result, little was accomplished. Afghanistan is a case study of what happens when the United States abandoned its leadership role in an international security crisis. What's most remarkable is that it hasn't turned out even worse. More resources also means more money from us and the international community. But as the President's plan makes clear, more of the money needs to reach the Afghan people, and much, much less of it should be spent inside the Beltway on consultants or on overhead. Our assistance should be used to purchase goods and services from Afghan providers and to put Afghans to work. We can't talk about strategy in Afghanistan without talking about narcotics and the corrosive effect drug trafficking has on security and governance. Afghanistan is the source of 93% of the world's opium, and even though the most recent report by the UN Office on Crime and Drugs show an increase in the number of poppy-free provinces and an overall decrease in the amount of opium produced, there is still far too much drug money sloshing around in Afghanistan, tempting everyone from local policemen to provincial governors. Afghans will never believe they have a real alternative to the Taliban as long as they see local and even national officials on the take. Opium eradication, crop substitution, effective transportation for those crops, and improved local security all have to be combined in order to make legal crops safe and profitable for Afghan farmers. In a nation where 70% of the population lives in the countryside, safe and profitable alternatives to poppy production are not optional. The President's strategy recognizes the need for an effective counter-narcotic strategy by combining the elements I've just described with new authorities for the U.S. and NATO forces to directly support Afghan counter-narcotics units during the interdiction of narcotics traffickers. There's one more element necessary for a successful strategy, and that is a coherent regional approach, in particular, one that deals effectively with Iran and Pakistan. As usual, Iran has tried to have it both ways in Afghanistan. On the one hand, they have legitimate concerns regarding the impact of narcotics trafficking and the attendant instability that results, yet there is also significant evidence that Iran has shipped weapons to the Taliban in an effort to gain leverage over us. The United States has talked to Iran before in the context of Afghanistan, and it is a positive sign that Iran attended the international meeting on Afghanistan earlier this week. But while we seek their cooperation in Afghanistan, we should also insist that they stop arms shipments to the Taliban in accordance with UN Security Council Resolution 1390. The question of Pakistan's role is even more complex and frankly merits its own separate hearing. Suffice to say that the entire endeavor in Afghanistan is unlikely to succeed if terrorist safe havens in Pakistan are not eliminated. The government of Pakistan, and more importantly, the people of Pakistan, must come to realize that the terrorists they have nurtured for decades have now turned on them, as this week's attack in Lahore clearly demonstrates. The fight against extremists is not solely an American fight, nor is it solely an Afghan fight. The fight belongs to Pakistan, too. It is a fight for their very existence as a nation, and they ignore the problem at their own peril. I cannot say it more clearly. There is a real and present danger to Pakistan's survival, but it comes from inside, not outside the country. President Obama's strategy for Afghanistan is a welcome, indeed desperately needed change from 8 years of reliance on an ad hoc, underfunded, undermanned, uncoordinated, and faith-based strategies. It is finally time to devote our attention, our energy and resources to defeating the terrorists who attacked us on 9/11. My strong view is that the President has given us a realistic strategy to accomplish that goal. And now I would like to turn to our good friend, acting in place of the ranking member, Mr. Rohrabacher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate you calling this hearing, and I appreciate the many years that we have spent discussing this issue as things got better and got worse and got better and got worse over the years. I certainly support the President's new focus on Afghanistan. I'm not sure if it is a policy. I've been listening very closely as people have been talking, and I will listen very closely today to see if it is a strategy. It doesn't seem to be that way to me, Mr. Chairman. It seems to be statements and seems to be concepts that are being thrown out. I would hope that this, number one, isn't just for PR, and that instead what we've got from the administration is a policy in the making. Perhaps what the President is doing, and perhaps what we've seen and how we've been briefed for the last month, is an example of the administration reaching out and trying to find new ideas and trying to come up with a strategy. So far, all I've heard are slogans that, most of which I will hate to say, will not work. When we look back on Afghanistan, a lot of people blame Ronald Reagan for involving us there with supporting the Mujahideen against the Soviet army. I do not believe that was a mistake. I think that support helped end the Cold War. I think the bravery and courage of the Afghan people, coupled with President Reagan's willingness to help them, brought an end to the Cold War. The Afghans played a significant part, and thus we owe them a great debt. However, when President Bush, the first President Bush, was in power after the Russians were forced out, we walked away. So if we have to find where the chain of responsibility is, I don't put it on people who would say that helping the Mujahideen and ending the Cold War was where this started. That was successful. What wasn't successful was after President Reagan left, the senior President Bush cut a deal with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and walked away and let the future of Afghanistan, these brave people who fought and died in an alliance with us, let them just sleep in the rubble. Furthermore, when President Clinton became president, in order to stabilize the situation, a further deal was made for the United States to covertly support the Taliban. Yes, right. The United States, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan created the Taliban, and during the Clinton administration, they dutifully supported the Taliban against the forces within Afghanistan that did not want that type of radical Islamic government. There can be so many examples of that that it was mind-boggling at the time. But let me note, even here we have had witnesses that on the record have contradicted the State Department when Ben Gilman sat in this seat along with me and requested all of the documents from the State Department in our dealing with Afghan policy. The State Department not only did not comply, but arrogantly cut us off, and that's the chairman of this committee, from information. And just a few weeks ago, from when former Secretary of State, Assistant Secretary of State Inderfirth was here, there was testimony indicating that a memo had been sent with very important information, which is exactly what we were requesting, that was withheld from us by the State Department. This is a democratic society. We can't put up with that, Mr. Chairman. We need to have an honest discussion of issues between the executive and legislative branch. This isn't closed government making decisions and we elected officials being told about it. So now we have President Obama. During the Bush years, of course, we paid for what happened with our support of the Taliban and by former President Bush's walking away. We paid for it in 9/11. And I would note, I will submit for the record places where about 10 times I suggested that. You were present during my warnings that if we did not change our policy in Afghanistan, it would come back and hurt us in a big way. So President Bush, after 9/11, was forced to deal with that, President George W. Bush. Unfortunately, he walked away as well. We walked away and turned the corner and went over to Iraq. And instead of keeping our promises to the Afghan people who drove out the Taliban, the people who had committed the crime against us, we walked away and spent our money in another endeavor in Iraq. We walked away again. We didn't keep our promise again. And all of this talk about how we defeated the Taliban after 9/11 is just nonsense. It was the Afghan people and it was the remnants of the Mujahideen. It was the Northern Alliance that drove the Taliban out of Afghanistan, again with our help. based on a promise that we would now stick with them, and we did not. So now we have President Obama. And I hear what's being said, but I hate to suggest that, as I say, I don't see the policy. I'm hoping this is a policy in the making. If it is, let's have a discussion about it today. But from what I have heard, the ideas being presented will not work. And the situation will not get better. Mr. Chairman, the structure that I have been told, about, the structure that we've seen in quote, classified briefings, the structure that we are supporting is a non-democratic structure for Afghanistan. Let me repeat that. We keep hearing about democracy and how important it is, freedom. There is what we've been presented by the administration is a plan that will not permit democracy at the local level. And I would challenge the administration, I would challenge anyone who cares about the Afghan people or wants to finally find a solution to understand that Afghanistan has never been ruled from the center, and we should admit that, and we should embrace it, and we should make sure that people all the way down to the village have a right to elect their local officials. Our plan is based on provincial governors being appointed, district people being appointed, all the way down to the bottom. And let me suggest that that is exactly the wrong approach. We've not included the local militias. Again, we talk about building the Afghan army and cutting deals with other governments, with the leaders of other governments. That will not work. Mr. Chairman, and again, your thoughts on the drug war were, I think, on target. But yet what I have heard is a downplaying of our commitment for drug eradication in Afghanistan. So I think that this is vitally important for us to discuss these issues. There are serious questions for those of us who are supporting an effort that will succeed in Afghanistan. But what we have now is a plan, from what I can see, is a non-plan that won't work. So let's discuss it. Let's work with the administration, try to come up with something that will work so that we don't walk away again with a tragedy in the making in Afghanistan. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Carnahan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief because I want to hear from our witnesses. I'm glad to see President Obama and his renewed emphasis on the region that launched the 9/11 attacks on our country. But we cannot have a U.S. strategy on Afghanistan unless we have a U.S. strategy on Afghan poppy and how to deal with that. It's, as the chairman said in his remarks, over 90% of the world's poppy. We have to look at broader, smarter strategies in terms of alternative crops, genetically altered crops, legal markets in terms of use by pharmaceutical companies. These cash crops have fueled extremist and terrorist activity. It lines the pockets of corrupt officials and skews government reforms. Drug routes make their way through Europe and also to the U.S. and even to my home city of St. Louis. So this has to be fundamental in our U.S. strategy, and I look forward to hearing about that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The ranking member, Mr. Burke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry I was a little late. There's a heck of a traffic jam out there on the road. I sat there for over an hour, which might be of interest to everybody.
A break for us.
I'm anxious to hear from the witnesses today. The one thing that I recall about Vietnam was that the enemy had the ability to go into sanctuaries across borders. And as a result, in Cambodia and Laos, which were supposedly prohibited from being attacked, led to one of the big problems that we faced in that conflict. We now have a similar situation with Pakistan. The Taliban and their contemporaries seem to go back and forth across that border with some ease, and I do admire the administration for going after them with drones and air-to-surface missiles that knock out some of their leaders. But I'd just like to know today how far we're willing to go. Pakistan was very instrumental in us winning the war helping them win the war, the Afghan tribal leaders win the war against the Russians. And that was a conduit for us getting some military equipment in there that shot down Russian helicopters. I think Dana knows about that because you were over there. But I'd like to know how far the cooperation with the Pakistanis is going to go, what kind of problems they're going to face with the people inside their country that are upset about the United States hitting targets in Pakistan, and whether or not we're willing to go all out to eliminate those sanctuaries so that the Taliban can't run back and forth across that border with impunity. I think that's one of the key elements. I believe our troops in every single battle where there's been a fight have done very, very well. They've won. But the problem is if we can't pursue them back across that border and knock them out in their areas of sanctuary, I think we're going to have a long and drawn-out problem. So I'd like to have some answers about that from our witnesses, and I really appreciate you being here today.
Thank you. Mr. Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the witnesses coming to talk to us today about these the important strategies as we move forward on Afghanistan. I had a chance to travel with the chairman and others, Democrats and Republicans, to Afghanistan a couple of months ago, and to see firsthand some of the things on the ground, met with some of the military leaders and some of the civilian leaders, met with some of our folks to get some ideas on the PRTs, the teams that are doing the reconstruction. And I also had a chance recently to meet in Washington with Minister Zia to talk about the National Solidarity Program. And I think that what I heard in the laying out of the policy from the administration, which I appreciate the fact that it is being thought through from top to bottom, with excellent advice from our military leaders, with excellent advice from our non-military people who understand what it's going to take to get the Afghan people to support this, which is the redevelopment of their country, switching from poppies to wheat or pomegranates or anything else. But recognizing that it's not just military power that will be the solution here. And your comments today, if you can talk to us about the National Solidarity Program, your thinking on whether it's working, how it's working, the notions of the transparency, the money going in, outcome coming out. And obviously that, as well as the coordinated effort, Mr. Chairman, we heard about the reconstruction teams that the United States is putting forward. We heard a lot about European different countries doing it, and not a lot of coordination. And we all know that, you know, the effectiveness of this thing will be effective coordination and the ability to share information and strategies. So if you could comment on those as well, I'd appreciate it. And I thank the Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Ellison.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for this excellent hearing, very timely. I'd like to also thank our witnesses, Dr. Von Hippel, Dr. Cordesman, and Dr. Jones. Appreciate all of you being here to share with us. I am very pleased about the new strategy on Afghanistan and Pakistan, and I'm also encouraged to see that the United States is intending to pursue a smarter, more comprehensive strategy, particularly on more constructive diplomacy through enhanced cooperation with local leaders and international partners to promote a reconciliation process. I'd like to hear about that in the course of the witness testimony. Also welcome policy to support basic human rights for Afghan people and the focus on regional and civilian-led approach, and an emphasis on reconstruction and development that's been accompanied by a regular monitoring and evaluation. I am concerned, and I would like to hear some testimony about yesterday's suicide bombings in Kandahar that killed 13 people, including 2 Provisional Council officials, and by a missile strike in northwest Pakistan yesterday that killed about 10 people. I'd like to get some information on that and be brought up to date, if possible. And I'd also like to be interested to hear your views, all the panelists, on the analyses of these incidents and what they mean in the larger framework. I'd also like to know, we've talked about Pakistan and the important regional role it plays, but I'm also aware that Ambassador Holbrooke met briefly with Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister at the Hague Conference in the Netherlands, and I'd like to know what role Iran might play in a constructive way regarding the stabilization and development of Afghanistan. I think it's important to take all these factors into consideration And in this regard, I'd like to hear your opinions about the different and complementary roles that Ambassador Holbrooke and Ambassador Ross and Senator Mitchell could play in enhancing a regional approach. And most importantly, I'm interested to hear about the implementation aspect of the new strategy and how we can avoid repeated past mistakes. I'm glad to hear the level of passion on both sides of the aisle about the importance of a new way forward in Afghanistan, and hope that we can work in a bipartisan way to see a stable, productive, and prosperous Afghanistan. Thank you.
Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for organizing this hearing, and thanks to our witnesses for appearing today. Running a little bit late because I have a hearing in oversight and government reform at the same time, so forgive me for running back and forth. After reviewing President Obama's plan for Afghanistan and Pakistan, I'm optimistic about the progress we can achieve in the region. We must commit ourselves to the goal of attaining long-term stability in South and Central Asia by dismantling al-Qaeda. However, we must not let our enthusiasm for peace in Afghanistan and Pakistan temper our firm insistence on accountability for all parties involved. After my own recent visit to Afghanistan, I agree with the President that all who have a stake in the security of the region should cooperate to stabilize that country. Not only must we work with the people of Afghanistan, however, we must also look to Pakistan, a key regional player in the Asian subcontinent. We have an opportunity to work with Pakistan, and we must ensure that Pakistani, American, and Afghani interests are aligned toward one goal: peace and stability in the region. The state of Pakistan can be a formidable ally in our desire for regional stability, but there remain unanswered and lingering doubts about Pakistan's full commitment to these objectives in Afghanistan. To this end, Congresswoman Harman and I, along with Congresswoman Tauscher and Congressman Royce, a fellow member of this subcommittee, have introduced H.R. 1463 to condition future military aid to Pakistan on two things: that the Pakistani government make AQ Khan available for questioning by U.S. authorities, and that it monitor Mr. Khan's activities. With the cooperation of the United States, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, we can work to eliminate Taliban strongholds which threaten the peace-loving citizens of three nations, as well as peace-loving citizens in the rest of the world. As the President has stated, our NATO allies and our other partners, the Central Asian states, Gulf nations, Iran, Russia, India, and China, have a stake in the promise of lasting peace and security and development in the region. Mr. Chairman, if I might ask, I'd be interested in the panelists' reaction to the legislation I made reference to, introduced by Congresswoman Harman and myself and others, about the need for Pakistan to produce the scientist who's been credited perhaps as being the #1 nuclear proliferator in the history of humankind, to make sure that he's available to U.S. authorities as a precondition for continued military cooperation and assistance to Pakistan. Dr. Von Hippel. Any reaction to that legislation or that notion?
We're just making opening statements.
Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman. I'm so sorry.
No problem. Thank you very much. We'll have a chance to go around again with questions. Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding hearing today, and I welcome our panel. President Obama recently announced the results of his administration's strategic review of the Afghanistan-Pakistan policy, viewing the two as intertwined, and I couldn't agree more with the President. I visited the border with our colleague Mike McCall and Congressman Cuellar between Pakistan and Afghanistan last summer and saw how porous it is. Pakistani and Afghan militants are increasingly merging and pooling their efforts against governments in both countries, and these militants also threaten the supply lines for our forces. Yet Pakistan has not cooperated as best as they can with us in putting pressure on the Taliban leaders. What are our recommendations for addressing this issue as this panel has moved forward toward with a Pakistani bill this spring? Going back to the topic of Afghanistan, General David McKiernan, the overall NATO and U.S. commander in Afghanistan, maintains that our mission is winnable, and after my visit, I know firsthand how hard our military is working towards this mission, not only fighting the insurgents, but through civilian efforts aimed at rebuilding Afghanistan's economy and infrastructure. I have to admit, I flew around to Host and Gardis and in Ghazni with a one-star general, Mr. Chairman, who told us, he said, he was trained as a helicopter pilot, and yet his biggest issue now is not only building that road from Host to Gardis, but also making sure we build health clinics and schools in the area. And he said, we're fighting the outlaws, but we also need to make sure we bring a different way of life to the folks. And I think that's our stated mission, and we need to stick with that. While I was there, I visited the 451st Civil Affairs Unit, Army Reserve, that was from the district I represent, and they were working on building that road and working out in the community in those areas. And I think we're making progress with our civilian efforts, but we need to redouble those efforts and make sure that we not only deal with the military side, but also with the bringing up the average wage and lifestyle of the Afghanistanis. I have questions on how well our efforts have been as far as nation building. Some observers say that the Afghan people have become disillusioned with the corruption in President Karzai's government, and this sentiment is causing many to accommodate Taliban insurgents. I'm interested in our panel's views on this, particularly with the presidential election set for August, and what is their understanding of the prospects for President Karzai to be reelected, and if he isn't, what could this mean for our policy toward Afghanistan? And again, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for this hearing. It's so important to our country.
Thank you very much. Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Mr. Chairman, let me to add my appreciation for the continued effort of this subcommittee being keenly current in its assessment of America's foreign policy and as well its impact on America's foreign policy. The hearing today on Afghanistan, I think, gives us an opportunity to probe the positions and the proposals of the administration. There is no doubt that many of us who had differing opinions on the war in Iraq have consistently said that our focus should have been on Afghanistan. I do think the issue of the 17,000 troops and 4,000 trainers will continue to be monitored by many of us who don't want to see a long, extended strategy that puts us somewhat in the predicament of an ongoing 50-year presence, but we recognize that focus, collaboration is crucial. However, I also believe that partnership is important, and certainly the partnership with Pakistan is a must. I also believe that we have to reframe our sunglasses on Pakistan and recognize that Dr. Khan represented an era, not a totality. All of us want to fight nuclear proliferation, but if we are to overcome the Taliban and the host position that Pakistan seems to have with respect to Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda and Taliban interests that want to destroy both countries, then they have to be a viable partner. We have to look at the issues of economic development in Pakistan, education in Pakistan. We have to face the illiteracy rate in Afghanistan. We also have to face the reality that it is a decentralized country. I don't know how any president, whether it's President Karzai or someone else, is going to alter the structure that Afghanis have lived under for centuries. But I do believe it's important for this committee to have a strategy in collaboration with the administration, and I would offer as I close that strategy should be restoring governance of Afghanistan to its people, letting them have the resources to educate their children, cease and desist or eliminate the Taliban's authority in Afghanistan, recognize the vitality of the Pakistan people who want to have a democratic nation, bolster their democratic opportunities, and join with them to insist on their participation in the opposition to terrorism. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Costa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, our witnesses. I think today's hearing and the title, Achieving Peace and Stability in the Graveyard of Empires, is an apt title for the discussion at hand. My first visit to Afghanistan was 4 years ago, and like many of my colleagues, visiting not only in Kabul, but going down to Kandahar and visiting our PRTs, our Provincial Reconstruction Team settings, and attempting to whether it build clinics or schools or roads, the amazing things that the NATO forces have been able to do, but yet realizing that that is not necessarily the primary effort or operations of a force, a combat force whose principal role is to focus on the Taliban and al-Qaeda and to clear the area for a peaceful government for Afghanistan. And so how we transfer the soft power in a way that makes sense on roles that I think are really more appropriate of the Department of State and other areas, I'd be interested in terms of the witnesses' comments here today. Clearly, the notion that first 4 years ago when I went, that the president of Afghanistan was not a lot more than the mayor of Kabul. 4 years later is one I think we need to consider vis-a-vis the corruption that's taken place. And I'd be interested on your take on the progress of that. I was there last year, 4 years later, went up to Kumbar province, up past Tora Bora, saw again the roads that we're building and the progress that has been made in some areas. But I want to know from the witnesses today about this multi-strategy, how we do it in collaboration with our allies in NATO, where that leads to vis-a-vis an exit strategy, how well you think this has been enunciated just last week by the President's new policy, and whether or not you think it's practical or whether or not, in fact, it can be implemented. And the long haul, because I really think this is akin to, I noted 4 years ago and last year when I was there again, Korea in this sense. We ended the conflict in '52, but in the '50s and the '60s it was a tough slog. And the success of South Korea really hasn't been acknowledged until the last 20, 30 years. So, I mean, that's the kind of long haul I think we're in for if this is going to be successful. Therefore, stability in a graveyard of empires, I think trying to achieve this peace is so aptly named, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend you for your thought on this, and I look forward to the testimony that we will receive.
Thank you. I'll pass the kudos to the staff for coming up with the title of the hearing. Speaking of long haul, the bells have indicated that there are votes that are beginning in the House. Unfortunately, it is a long series of votes. This is usually the point of the hearing. Having heard our conclusions, you would edify us with the facts. What I think we would do is forego for now the introduction of the expert witnesses, because some of us are old, and by the time we come back, we'll forget who you were. It looks like we have at least an hour and a quarter worth of votes. So rather than interrupt you, we will break now, let you stand down and think of how to respond to some of the questions that you're bound to hear, and go off to the floor. I'd encourage members to return, but usually history shows us that there'll be few of us and your odds will improve. We stand in recess.
Thank you.